I don't like yelling.
He just put on and goes, come on, come on! You wanted a party? Yeah, let's go!
I've never found that an argument was really made stronger through yelling, nor had I ever really seen any points that were made more salient when you're screaming.
Hey, join the club, okay?
It just always felt childish and demeaning to your very argument.
Alternative facts? Who the says that?
Now, when I fell in love with stand-up comedy, there was this kind of looming subset of stand-up that I was kind of vaguely aware of, built on screaming, and anger really seemed to be these comedians' stock in trade. Some people call them truth tellers, but I like to call this style of comedy, I like to think of them as prophets. They're the people who kind of feel like they just rode in a flurry to like jump through the doors and tell us everything that we need to know and teach us about why we're doing things wrong and tell us how to fix it.
Take all that money we spend on weapons and defense each year and instead spend it feeding, clothing, and educating the poor of the world, which it would many times over, not one human being excluded, and we can explore space.
You know, there are these comedians that seem to hate the government, hate the Catholic Church, hate authority, and really want to stick it to them. It's a lot of ranting, it's a lot of anger, and it's a lot of yelling.
That whole changing the world thing never really kicked in. The revolution was starting where I thought I could yell at 200 people in a bar every night and change the world. Yeah, it didn't quite happen.
When I think of these prophets, I think of comedians like Bill Hicks, Lewis Black, Sam Kinison, Denis Leary, comedians of a certain period of time within the history of stand-up, and I don't just mean the cocaine of the 80s that kind of bled into the 90s. I think there's a lot more than that, but it is still a part of it. I think these comedians kind of belong to the ethos of America at that time, where you were dealing kind of with these aging hippies and emerging yuppies and all of the blurry hypocrisy of the Reagan era, where it felt like someone needed to stand up and speak for truth and really tell people what was going on and how they could fix it. You know, these comedians taught their audiences how to fight back and how to stand up for what they believe in. I think one of the pitfalls of this genre is it's one of the genres within comedy that is the most likely to not be funny. And when I say that, I don't mean that it is unsuccessful. I mean that sometimes in profit comedy, we forget that humor is even a goal.
He stopped, I think, worrying about whether he was being funny or not.
It becomes sidestepped by a goal for revolution or insight or inspiration. These kind of secondary goals of stand-up have been promoted to primary goals, and while I have no problem with comedy that inspires, I think that can confuse an audience and can alienate an audience who doesn't know what they're doing. For example, Bill Hicks's last album, Rant in E minor, is appropriately named. I don't know if I would call it stand-up if I came across it in the wild. I think it is something else. I think in Bill Hicks's later life, he kind of developed this art form that merges political rants and public speaking and one-man shows and stand-up comedy. I think it's something new. Kinison, on the other hand, was a fire and brimstone Pentecostal pastor before he became a stand-up.
I used to preach. I used to study the Bible. It's a pretty fascinating book.
If I can't be myself with the Father, then I'm going to stop preaching this gospel. Every time it was going to last forever. Remember, you f***ing
He has a very specific oeuvre and a cult following that I don't understand, but comedians who I love and trust adored him.
Go find Sam Kinison and listen to him. He still holds up.
The first album I listen to every year. The first album, Hotter Than Hell, is great.
Great.
I don't like yelling, but I learned so much from these comedians. Sam Kinison I still don't quite understand, but I think this breed has so much to offer the world, and I can really owe it all to one particular prophet comedian, and that comedian is Barry Crimmins.
Okay, thanks. Okay, all right. I'm a busy guy, I don't have a lot of time, so listen up.
As a comedy nerd, I was embarrassed that I only found out about Barry Crimmins about a year ago. That's terrifying, but it seems to be the norm. It's not a name that you hear very often. He was a warrior, though, and he deserves so much of our attention and our love and our gratitude.
Why do women go to the bathroom in Paris? Because they get hassled by drunk men.
Got caught smuggling books into Kentucky. Got off on a technicality no one could prove they were books.
I found out about Barry through a documentary made by Bobcat Goldthwait. I, at the time, was in the throes of an obsession with Bobcat Goldthwait, the origins of which I can't really understand. But I found him so fascinating and so endearing, and I still do. But I knew that if I watched this documentary, I was in store for a yeller. That was very clear from the trailer.
Well, there's a couple of things I have to accomplish, and if I do, I think I'll be able to put my little tile in the grand mosaic of life. And those two things are, I'd like to overthrow the government of the United States, and I'd like to close the Catholic Church.
But I trusted Bobcat, and I trusted the direction in which Barry seemed to be yelling.
You know who the biggest suckheads in the world are? The people who think they're clever and are like, well, I happen to be politically incorrect. And now you get to act like you're a cutting-edge rebel because you're reinforcing the oppressive status quo, you sack of rancid horse.
Throughout Call Me Lucky, which is Bobcat Goldthwait's film of Barry Crimmins, which, by the way, is brilliant if you haven't seen it, you kind of learn that this anger and this vitriol within Barry Crimmins does come from this very noble place. Barry is huge and lumbering and often kind of sweaty and disheveled with his thick black hair and his glorious mustache. He was a real presence, and by all accounts he was the father of the comedy scene in Boston in the 80s.
Spawned all of these great humorists.
Paula Poundstone,
Lenny, Kevin Meaney, Denis Leary.
The thing about Barry Crimmins that helped me to get through my reservations about this kind of genre of stand-up comedy came from the fact that all of his anger came very directly from pain. And this was pretty transparent in his stand-up. He would go on these kind of tirades that all felt like they were coming from a very vulnerable place.
He would go into a rage.
Watch the kind of stuff I can do here.
Just get out. I don't like you.
There was something about Barry that rang incredibly authentic.
That oil belongs to the Arabs, okay? That's their oil. If we're concerned about oil, what we should stop doing is using so much oil. That's what we can control.
Now, there was a very definite point when Barry made a switch from an angry, yelling comedian to a comedian who was fighting for a direct cause. And that switch happened in 1992 when Barry was able to talk about his own demons on stage. It was in July at the Club Stitches in 1992, and after being on stage for a while, he started to open up about some physical abuse and sexual abuse that was in his past, speaking frankly with the audience. The next day, there were articles written with headlines like, "Comedian Bears Soul," and it feels kind of akin to Tig Notara's Live. It felt like this true moment was occurring between this comedian and this specific audience. What makes Barry is that he didn't stop. He began speaking and writing and really emptying his soul and talking honestly about these horrific things that happened in his past.
It's scary for anybody of any age to really see someone who's the face of evil.
He began looking for support groups, and that's how he stumbled upon something very terrible going on in the dark corners of the early days of the internet.
When AOL was in its infancy, he was looking for other survivors in chat rooms.
Barry called me up, he said, look at this. And I went, wow, I couldn't believe, what I was seeing.
Barry Crimmins continued to fight. He fought when AOL wasn't responding to any of his emails. He fought when the police had no idea what to do. This is before a lot of police stations even had computers. Barry was fighting, and he was gathering information, and he was doing everything he could until one day in 1995 when he was invited onto the floor of the Senate to speak at a meeting entitled Child Pornography and the Internet. Barry Crimmins went toe-to-toe with the corporate lawyers of AOL and fought for these children whose lives he saw just being broken apart.
After months of knocking on AOL's door, I was suddenly face to face before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee.
AOL is the key link in a network of child pornography traffickers.
They weren't quite sure what to make of Barry.
You know, there is some justice in the world, and Barry Crimmins really helped to put a lot of it in place. You know, I've seen Tig Notaro teach us how to talk about tragedy, and I've seen Pete Holmes teach us how to think about spirituality, but I've never seen a comedian evoke such literal and seismic change. A lot of the practices that he fought for are still in act today when it comes to internet safety. Over 1,000 criminals have been indicted since Barry Crimmins first fought on the floor of the Senate. Crimmins is a beautiful example of someone fighting for what they believe in. And maybe things would be different if I had found him before I found Sam Kinison. I think for me, a big part of growing up was learning that sometimes you need to yell. As I aged, I learned about bigger and bigger monsters that had been shielded to me, rightfully so, as a child. But the more I learned about these monsters who are large and ferocious, that sometimes all we have is our voice, our barbaric yawp. And these comedians make good use of that barbaric yawp.
I would like you to give us a demonstration of a barbaric yawp. Come on, you can't yawp sitting down. Let's go, come on, up.
Towards the end of Bobcat's documentary, he goes through this beautiful speech about how he really considers himself lucky. And he's a survivor, grew up to be a big, strong man, a man who can make people think critically about things and make people change. And I think the thing that Barry Crimmins did for me personally is teach me that sometimes we need to yell, and sometimes we need to get angry.
Yawp, oh, that's a mouse. Come on, louder. Yawp. Oh, good God, boy, yell like that. There it is.
I want you to take good care of yourselves. I want you to take good care of each other. And I want you to never tire of protesting until justice is achieved. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was Prophet Comedians with our little highlight on the man Barry Crimmins. Comment your favorite angry ranting comedian down below, and look forward to another genre next week. If you liked it, like it. If you want to subscribe. And we'll be back. Thank you so much.